Tonight, we're going to be speaking about Iran. We've had a lot of big developments happening on Iran recently that have kind of gotten buried just because of all the attention on Ukraine, on the U.S., on a lot of other international issues. But a lot of important things have been happening in Iran that I think merit discussion. Our guest tonight is Negar Mortazavi, who's an Iranian American journalist and political analyst based here in Washington, D.C., who has been covering Iranian affairs and U.S.-Iran relations for over a decade. She's host of the Iran podcast. Her previous work includes serving as a columnist and a diplomatic correspondent for The Independent, a host on Voice of America, and Washington Correspondent for Iran International. Welcome, Negar. And for our the first question I kind of wanted to throw at you, and by the way, folks, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, upvote others' questions, and we'll pass them along. The first question is about this most recent wave of protests that's been happening in Iran. There was a building collapse in Abadan, and then there's been seemingly a pretty broad wave of protests coming off of that. And there had already been some protests going before that. So tell us what's going on. What's the situation?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, John, and your team. It's a pleasure to be here. And hello to those who have tuned in. It's a very important issue, as you're saying, one of the most important current domestic issues in Iran. There have been rounds of protests starting in early May, which was triggered as a response to a sudden increase in food prices, food and other staples for the average Iranian family. Suddenly prices went up. Essentially, government subsidies were removed for certain staples, and that triggered a large round of protests that spread to many cities and areas in the country. And it sort of builds on previous rounds of protests or cycles of protests that sort of start with ongoing economic grievances. The Iranian economy, and we can talk about this later in more depth, but the Iranian economy is in a pretty bad state. And there's also a lot of corruption and mismanagement and incompetence by the leaders in the country, which the Iranians see and observe and are upset about. The population, there's this sense of hopelessness for the future among certain demographics. It's a very young population. About 70% of the country is under the age of 40, if not younger, which means the majority, like myself, were born after the 1979 revolution. And it's an ongoing sort of cycle of anger at the way the government is running sort of the country, which has created the economic situation. I want to also add the factor of economic sanctions, this external factor, U.S. crippling economic sanctions, which has triggered or targeted every major industry in Iran. With that, and then we see the protests quickly turning political, with the slogans becoming very radical against top leadership, the supreme leader, the president, and a lot of anger and frustration. So it's not exactly accurate to just call them economic protests, because yes, they're triggered by economic event, as it has in certain instances in the past, but they quickly turn what is seen as political with slogans and radical demands and chants essentially against the country's leadership. And then this also coincided with a tragic event, a terrible event of a high rise in the city of Abadan in southern Iran, in the province of Khuzestan, a building called Metropole, which collapsed, and dozens of people have been killed, were caught up under the rubble. And then the way the local government was also dealing with the issue was not satisfactory by the local population, because people thought that First of all, the building wasn't built with proper standards, is what one of the main criticisms that people or protesters in that area talk about. The other was that when there were protests and critics coming out speaking about this, there was a crackdown of protests that were happening around this event, this collapse of the high rise, instead of focusing the resources, the state's resources, on the relief, on the rescue effort. So certain bodies or some alive have been rescued from the rubble, but it was another triggering, really tragic incident that happened at the same time. And I want to also add this about Abadan, because Abadan is a major city in the province of Khuzestan where all of Iran's oil lies, essentially. So it's an oil-rich, we call it the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. But it's not a rich province when you look at the economic situation of the average citizen living in Khuzestan. So this is another feeling that not only Abadanis, but the broader population of Khuzestan has, that they're sitting on this wealth of natural resources of the whole country, not just their own resources, but it's literally being taken or stolen away robbed away from under their feet, and they're not seeing the benefits or the wealth that this oil is bringing to some other parts of the country. There's also a shortage of water. It's a very hot part of the country in the south, just by the Persian Gulf. So mismanagement of the state, combined with environmental and issues and drought, has caused a shortage of water in that area. Pollution, air pollution has been a very serious issue. So there's multiple layers of grievances that have built up over the years, and these events just trigger more and more protests. But then again, the collapse of the high rises in Abadan wasn't something that only triggered protests in Abadan. It sort of added a layer to what the rest of the country was protesting, and you would see essentially the other parts of the country coming out and sending messages of sympathy and condolences to the people of Abadan after that collapse.
Yeah, this wave of protests, how extensive would you say that it is? Because I've heard of these protests happening in several other cities. It seems like a lot of the focus is in Khuzestan proper, but is it really spreading throughout the country? You know, how does it compare to, for instance, the Aban protests from a couple of years ago, which seemed to be pretty much everywhere?
Well, the protests, John, as you're saying, it's not only in Khuzestan, it's in multiple areas of the country. It sort of hasn't completely ended. So it's one of those instances that we have to wait until after to get the actual stats and analysis. There's also limited access to information from, on the ground, as far as images, videos, and actual reporting, because there's also part of the crackdown on the protests is also this limiting of the information by the state. My observation is that it's maybe about the size of the Aban protest, which is the November 2019 protest, as you mentioned. And the trigger for that protest was also very similar. It was an increase or a hike in the price of fuel, of gas. And that triggered nationwide protests, because that's essentially another basic everyday life necessity. It essentially will increase all of your costs if your transportation cost is suddenly tripled overnight. So the crackdown of the Aban protest was also unprecedented. It became very violent, with security forces killing protesters, live rounds, direct shots to the head. We've seen disturbing images. We saw essentially later, but I don't know. So the quick answer to your question is, I don't know yet, but it's the cycle and the frequency of the protests that just keep going and going. And then simultaneously, we've been seeing protests by various different social groups. For example, teachers have been protesting in a different format. It's not exactly triggered. It's not The setup is very different. They have leadership. They have more organizational backing. They're more organized, and it's in different ways. But that's also something that's been going on. Nurses before the teachers were protesting. So it's these rounds and cycles of protests that we keep seeing. But this recent one that you mentioned started in May, is very similar to the one in November 2019, the Aban protests.
How secure do you think the regime feels with all of this? Because there's been some suggestion that with the Aban protests as well, that some of the people being mobilized against the behavior of the regime are coming from traditionally supportive parts of society, that especially some of these price increases have been hurting traditional bases of support for the regime. But at the same time, since 2009, they've built up their repressive apparatus so much. So how do things look from their perspective? Are they comfortable? Are they worried?
That's a great question, and it's multi-layered. Well, first of all, they're not comfortable because they crack down. That's the most important indication. If you were comfortable with criticism, you would tolerate it, and they very much don't tolerate it. But is it causing an existential threat to the state, if that's what you mean? It's, at any moment, these things also can escalate and get very big, as some people sometimes even compare to the 1979 revolutions. But I don't see that kind of massive threat as far as an existential threat to the actual existence of the state. But yes, they fear not only criticism, but also protest, especially when people take to the streets, when people are very angry, and when it's a demographic that you feel like they have nothing to lose because they're young, but they're also unemployed. The economy is in a very bad situation. So they don't see a future that would necessarily be bright or improved. And that also creates a lot of fear for the state. So from the crackdown, we can conclude that they're not comfortable with them, but how much of an existential threat this is another question. And then when it comes to 2009, I want to not to necessarily compare these protests, but one thing that we saw in 2009, and that was also because of the nature or the trigger of the protest, because it came out of the 2009 presidential election. So it was more of and essentially two of the candidates of that election who were accusing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of rigging the results, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, were the leaders of that movement. So it was a lot more structured. You had still political parties, reformist and moderate parties, active and officially, playing part of this game and essentially bringing their movements. And you also had the urban middle class, because those protests were very political. And I also want to get to this, the current protests. I don't want to say that these are not political, but the trigger is more economic. But in that case, in 2009, it was completely political. It was a presidential election. It was a political event. And people had voted, millions of people had voted in that election, but then thought like their vote was literally, as they call it, stolen. The slogan of that protest was, "Where's my vote?" So you had a large portion of the urban middle class, and mostly Tehran, because it's the capital, it's the country's major city. Unlike here, there's multiple big cities in the US. One is the center of something, the other is another. Iran is the capital, the largest city, the most populated, political, economic, everything, the center of everything. Like European capitals, many European capitals. So when the urban middle class in Tehran joins the protest in millions, that just brings it to a whole other level. So going back to that existential threat, I think the state actually felt like there was an existential threat in 2009. And that's why the leaders of that protest, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, were put on their house arrest, which hasn't completely ended to this day. And the crackdown was in a very, very different format as far as eliminating even the small leaders or the heads of networks for those protests. These protests, you don't see as much of that urban middle class population joining. But again, as you were saying, it's different demographics from more impoverished areas, suburbs of the cities or smaller area towns or villages. And that poses a different threat because, again, as you said, that's sort of one of the, not the only, but one of the traditional bases for the Islamic Republic and for the revolution. Although I would argue that the revolution also had the support of the urban middle class, it had the support of the intellectuals, the leftists, the students, different movements, but it was also seen as a revolution of the masses. And so part of those masses are essentially what you're seeing on the street in these rounds, the newer rounds of protests, because the trigger is economic. So it's posing a different form of threat, and we're also seeing a different reaction, a much more violent and iron fist sort of reaction on the streets, at least from security forces.
So turning our lens abroad for a moment, the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors was meeting today, and that the issue that Iran has had there kind of came to a head as well. Tell us what's going on kind of the nuclear front.
So the IAEA, the UN watchdog board of governors, just essentially voted or censored Iran for reducing cooperation with the IAEA. The vote was 32-2, if I'm not wrong. I was just checking the numbers, with Russia and China essentially voting against, and then 34 and 3 absentia. It's a mild move. It's not a big escalation. It's not a massive escalation. It is an escalation, but it's mild. And it's sort of taking it to the next level, but it's also short of, referring Iran to the Security Council and sort of following the previous path, which essentially led to a Security Council resolution under a former hardline president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So, it's not a pretty place. It's unfortunately, I was expecting or hoping that this issue, the nuclear issue, would be resolved through diplomacy much earlier than this. Obviously, under the Trump administration, during the Trump years, first President Trump threatened and then pulled out of the nuclear deal in 2018, imposed economic sanctions on the country, and the campaign of maximum pressure, then assassinations, and essentially military escalation, which really brought the two countries to the brink of war. At some point, you and I and many were observing and really fearing that things could get out of hand and the two sides could stumble into a serious conflict. And then with the Biden administration, with President Biden himself, first of all, criticizing the Trump administration for their maximum pressure policy, which is a maximum failure, essentially, as I believe also candidate Biden called it, and promising that he would resolve the issue diplomatically. There was more hope here in Washington among us Iran watchers that this would be resolved earlier. And I didn't expect it to get to this point, for us to be in June 2022, having to talk about an IAEA censure. So I think there was a golden window of opportunity at the beginning of the Biden administration, from January to June, when there was the presidential election in Iran, where the Biden team overlapped with the more pro-diplomacy administration in Tehran. And that window was unfortunately missed. And now there's a hardline administration in Iran. I think the calculation in Tehran still is that they value the JCPOA and they want to remain in the JCPOA at large. That's why they haven't left yet, even though the US is outside the deal. Iran hasn't left the deal, but they've reduced compliance. And, there's certain value for what they're willing to give in exchange for what they receive. So I think it's good that Iran hasn't left the JCPOA and hasn't escalated more than it has, but then at the same time, they've reduced compliance, and I think they will continue to reduce compliance, short of a conflict, of a major military conflict, which I don't think either side wants, especially the Biden administration. At some point, we sort of figured that even former President Trump didn't really want a war with Iran, even though he brought the country to the brink of it. But I think the Biden administration absolutely is not looking to instigate a conflict, but you can stumble into these things and the situation can get out of hand. It's a very volatile region. And if Iran sees this campaign of maximum pressure essentially continuing because sanctions have not been removed or relief has not been issued, then, we can see other forms of escalation from the Iranians. So it's overall, it's not a pretty place, but I think it's also not a major escalation yet.
Do you think that the negotiations are going to kind of stay where they are in this sort of freeze that they're at, that they might resume at some point soon or just totally fall apart?
I hope they don't fall apart. That's for one thing. As far as the negotiations resuming, I think that right now we know one of the major sticking point is the FDO designation of the IRGC. Would the Iranians sort of, back away from that demand or modify it? There's a possibility. I don't think it's a strong possibility, but there's a possibility. Never say never. Again, as I explained, I think the overall signaling from Tehran is that they want this to happen, but they've also put a value or a price for it. On the Biden side, unfortunately, I think with that window of opportunity or golden window of opportunity, which now looks so much more shiny from this distance, from this vantage point, with that window of opportunity missed, and then the change of administration in Tehran and the delay that the Iranian side imposed on the negotiations, and now with every month or week even that's missed, the closer you get to the midterm elections here, the more this becomes part of the domestic or national conversation in the US, and the political cost of it would be even higher. So if the Biden administration or the president himself, because I think this is something that has to come from the president, there's a high political cost attached to doing any kind of diplomacy with Iran. But it's something that President Obama was eventually willing to pay, and he did. And he took some heat for it. It wasn't easy. He took heat from Republicans. He took heat from certain Democrats in the U.S. and he also took heat from U.S. allies in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, with the former prime minister of Israel, giving a speech against it at the U.S. Congress. It wasn't pretty. But he did it, and that's required from the president. So if the administration wasn't willing to pay that political price early on when they had so much more distance from the midterm elections, the closer we get, the more worried I am that this political cost just becomes larger and larger, and it becomes even more difficult for them to finalize a deal, unless the Iranians make a major backtrack of their demand, which I also doubt. So I don't know. I think we're sort of the deal has been on life support. It's not dead, but it's been on life support or in a coma, as some call it. I think it will continue, but none of the two sides want to completely pull the plug, but none of the two sides will want to sort of pay that high price of fully resurrecting it.
So one of the other threads here, since you mentioned some of the military actions that could be contemplated, some of the potential for conflict, is that there have been a lot of people getting killed in Iran recently who have ties to either the nuclear issue or the drone program or the missile program. What's going on there?
Sorry, you got cut off for a second. Can you say the last part again?
That there have been several deaths recently involving people who in Iran are tied to the Quds Force or the missile program, the drone program, et cetera. There was the gentleman who was shot while sitting in his car. one of his colleagues allegedly fell from a roof. And then just the other day, someone was killed at a drone factory who allegedly, there have been several of these incidents. What's going on?
Right. And also a string of sabotages and attacks, not necessarily deadly, but in nuclear facilities and in other government facilities. I see it as part of the bigger sort of shadow war or the silent war. I mean, it's not so much silent and it's not so much in shadow, but between Iran and Israel, that none of the two sides really publicly acknowledge. And it's also a lot of it is happening on the ground in Syria. But then again, the nuclear issue is very much unrelated to Syria. It's another concern for the Israelis. But again, it's part of that bigger picture. And sort of the Israelis, they don't necessarily always take responsibility for it, but they've had these past history of assassinations of nuclear scientists in Iran, even as nuclear negotiations were happening, and sabotages, both for technical or I would say practical reasons of, destroying a facility or turning the nuclear program back, or, eliminating, killing essentially a central person in whatever the program is, if it's a nuclear program, if it's a missile program. But then also at the same time, I think part of the reason for these operations are political, is to minimize or create roadblocks on the path for diplomacy, to make it more difficult. Because at the end of the day, although I think the Biden administration has tried much harder than the Obama administration to bring the Israelis on board with diplomacy with Iran, with nuclear diplomacy, I don't think the Israelis it hasn't been very successful, and they're not on board, and they're still opposed to full-on diplomacy with Tehran. And I think part of these attacks and missions and sabotages are also to politically make it more difficult, and also to sort of provoke Iran to react in a way that would, again, also make it more difficult for the US, for Washington to continue diplomacy with Iran. So it's multiple layered again, but I definitely see it as that from that bigger picture. And then also it's the know-how and the ability. I mean, Iran has different enemies, but the Israelis are the ones who have the ability and the history of these kind of sabotages. So I think it's part of what's going on there.
So we've got a question from the audience from Max Segal, who asks, you mentioned that the main trigger for some of the recent protests was economic. How does the issue of economic sanctions factor into these protests? Are they creating added pressure on Tehran to get sanctions lifted? Do most Iranians support the government's holdout over the IRGC delisting demand, even as the IRGC is part of the crackdown?
So as far as sanctions, obviously sanctions have tremendous impact, economic sanctions, a broad economic sanctions. There's different kinds of sanctions. That's another discussion for another day, but human rights designations, terrorism, nuclear. But the broad economic sanctions, as US officials have many times called them crippling, have really crippled the Iranian economy. It's not completely crashed, but it's really in shambles, and it's again targeting every major industry in the country, and it's put a lot of pressure essentially on ordinary Iranians, on the population, not as much on the state or on government entities, but a lot more on the population, on average Iranians. Do we see that play out? If I want to connect it to the protests, we don't really see that play out in the protests. You don't see protesters coming out ever really talking about sanctions on the street, at least. I'm talking about street protests. Yes, in political discourse, in national political discourse, that's also part of the conversation. But on the street, you don't really hear people chanting against sanctions or the US or maximum pressure on all that. Because partly, first of all, they see their own, I don't want to speak for all, and I have to be careful here. I'm not speaking for all Iranians, but part of the population and many who I speak to first of all, see their own government policies responsible for the situation that have created the sanctions. I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but that's one view. And then the other is that they say even under such pressure, even if we concede that, yes, sanctions have created this much pressure, it's the responsibility, and I very much agree with the second part, if there is the responsibility of the government as a custodian of the population to create whatever opportunity is left in equal or, with a certain equity to the population to shield them from that kind of pressure instead of making it worse. As I mentioned, the corruption, the mismanagement, and the incompetence of government officials is something that's very visible. The inequality and the gap of wealth between the majority of the population and then a small political elite who are connected to the wealth, to the political/economic resources is something that makes people very, very angry. So you even have certain Iranians or a part of the population who actually support sanctions because they're like, their thinking is that the economy is pretty bad. There's all this pressure on us anyway. So let's just increase sanctions. So at least there will be some pressure projected on the government. Now, not everyone thinks like that. I would say still the majority is also, as much as they're against the government's policies, they also criticize sanctions from what I hear and speak to people on the ground. But going back to Max's question, it's not something that you see very much playing out on the streets. And I'm sorry, there was a second part to his question. Can you repeat that?
Yes, just that do people support the government taking a hard line on the IRGC terrorism designation issue, even when the IRGC is often part of these crackdowns?
It's a complicated issue because, yes, the IRGC or security forces are part of the crackdown, but the IRGC is also involved in almost every major sector of the Iranian economy. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, economic player. So the FTO designation and sanctions on the IRGC are not only going to impact the commanders, per se, of the IRGC or even the body of the IRGC, are going to impact a big chunk of the Iranian economy. So if we're talking on a theoretical level, that's one issue. But does that also mean that there is a lot of support for the IRGC in the country among the protesters at least? No, there isn't. There's also a lot of opposition to the IRGC and their policies, both domestic, also regional, inside the country. But not every single decision of the state is being consulted with the majority of the population. So there are certain areas in national security and regional policy that are very sensitive and very much opposed to what you assume the majority wants and believes. As far as the JCPOA and wanting diplomacy with the US and resolving the nuclear issue diplomatically, I would say that's something that the majority of the population and the state so far are on board. Overall, the Iranian government or the state wants this deal, but the details or the mechanics of it are not necessarily what the population is consulted with or supports.
So sticking with the regime's foreign policy, one of the things that we've heard from the Raisi presidency in its diplomacy has been a kind of discounting of the value of relations with the West and an emphasis on relations with neighbors and with more Eastern countries. How is this working out for them so far? Have they put this policy into effect?
So traditionally, or at least in the past 2 decades, the hardliners have had, which is what the Raisi government is, conservative/hardliner, have had a view to the East, and the East means Russia and China as major powers, and also just more trade with, for example, Asia than Europe. And the moderates or the reformists, or I would call them the more pro-diplomacy camp, pro-diplomacy with the West, have sort of a view to the West. That doesn't mean they don't want relations with China or Russia, but they've always, one of their motto has been that we need to resolve our issues with the US. We need to have better relations and trade and ties with Europe. And it's been the overall direction of their policy. So the shift to the east and shift to the west is something that's been happening with the change of administration. And as you said, the Raisi administration is doing that shift to the east, also as they're losing more and more hope in reviving the JCPOA, which if the JCPOA is revived, or a nuclear deal with the US is agreed on, and sanctions are lifted, then that means that Iran can, because it's one thing if you want, it's one thing if you can. And then Iran can do more trade, not necessarily with US companies. This didn't even happen under JCPOA for real, but with Europe or with the West. But if that doesn't happen, then Iran doesn't have much choice, even if they want to do trade with Europe, than to look more to the east. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy also of the hardliners or the conservatives, that what they want and what they can kind of overlaps, and they put less emphasis on the importance of diplomacy with the West, especially with the US, compared to the moderates and the reformists. And you can even see it in their discourse. So when the Raisi team came into power, again, the overall calculation in Tehran is that they want the JCPOA, they want to stay in the deal, but their negotiators wouldn't call it the JCPOA. They don't even say the name of the deal, because it's a deal that was made with the US by the predecessor, the moderate administration. They started calling it negotiations to remove the tyrannical sanctions from Iran, or the whatever similar term they call. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. And then this goes back to sort of your question, and maybe part of Max's question, is that sanctions relief is something that the hardliners want. So that's an overlap or a commonality between the hardliners and the moderates, because the sanctions have really crippled the economy. But what they're willing to pay to get the sanctions relief, or how much they're willing to afford to get the sanctions relief, is very much different when it comes to the two sides of the political spectrum in Iran. So yes, in short, we are seeing slowly that shift to the east, which has been, again, complicated by Russia's attack on Ukraine, but the political and economic, at least look, sort of, turning your gaze to the east has definitely happened, and also to the region. That's another sort of difference between Raisi administration and Rouhani's.
Yeah, so tell us a bit more about this impact that the Ukraine conflict has had on Iran, on its diplomacy. How has the government been responding to the situation there?
Well, it was unexpected, I think, inside the country, and it's created an uncomfortable dynamic, because, as I said, there was this shift or look to the east, and when you talk about the east, the two major powers or allies would be China and Russia. Russia even more when you look at it politically, militarily. Russia has been more supportive, more closer to Iran, as opposed to China, which is more on trade and economy. They occupy a little bit of a different space with some overlap, but they're two permanent members of the Security Council with veto power. Those are that's something Iran really relies on. Russia is a close ally of Iran and the Assad regime in Syria. Again, there's military collaboration there. It's also very much political when it comes to Iran foreign policy. So with Russia's attack on Ukraine, and Russia essentially weakened in the global stage, I think has impacted the calculation in Tehran and the confidence that they would put on Russia as a major power, nuclear power, or Security Council member in in the world. It's also from a historic perspective, Russia's attack on Ukraine is, yes, it's reminiscent of, people compare it to U.S. attacking Iraq, U.S. attacking Afghanistan. But then if you go a little further back, it's also Iraq's attack or Saddam's attack on Iran, which is something that the Islamic Republic has very much played as part of its narrative over the decades. So it's conflicting for a country that was attacked by an aggressor, a neighbor, to then come out and sort of be supportive of another power that's doing the exact same thing to another, to a weaker neighbor. So all of these things, and there's also a lot of criticism or resistance to Russia's attack on Ukraine in Iran among the population, the civil society, various political groups have been speaking out against it, encouraging or criticizing the government for not speaking out or siding with Russia when it comes to votes at the UN, when it comes to public and diplomatic signaling. So all of these have made things even more complicated, sort of for a smooth shift to the east.
And so kind of a follow-up question came from the audience from David Rolfing, who asks, does Iran import food from Russia or Ukraine? If so, how much impact has the war in Ukraine had on Iran's food prices, which you mentioned earlier are a hot political issue right now?
Food from Russia, that's a great question. I have to look at it. I don't have it on top of my mind. But from Ukraine, yes, Iran is has been one of the importers from Ukraine. From Russia, I have to go back and check. But the overall shortage and price increase, the global shortage of food and the increase in price has definitely impacted Iran, not necessarily the lack of direct import, but also the overall global prices. And then also it's a country that's under severe sanctions. So in the case, and this was very much the case with the pandemic. And also, I forgot to mention, the pandemic has also been a very important and significant event in the past 2-3 years, 2.5 years, that very much exacerbate all of these situations in the country. The impact of sanctions and mismanagement, the corruption, all of that also has a very vivid pandemic layer to it. But what I say because of sanctions is that if other countries can find alternatives for whatever is missing, for a country that's under immense amount of economic sanctions, it's even more difficult to find those alternatives and replace it. So yes, it's had an impact on Iran, adding to that issue of both domestic and foreign economic pressure.
You mentioned earlier that Russia is working with Iran in Syria, and we have a question from Chance Chancellor from our audience who asks, how do the people of Iran react to the Iranian government's militant foreign adventures in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon? I know I've heard some slogans in the protests about this.
Yes, so again, we can't speak for everybody. There's very opposing pockets of the population. It's also a very sensitive issue. So it's not something that people can freely necessarily all the time speak about, at least out in the media, but you do see and hear it in protests. Part of the base of, and I would say the more hardline or conservative base of the Islamic Republic is supportive. And it's also important to know that in the country, it's very much projected as the fight against ISIS. For example, Iran's presence in Syria is very much portrayed as them fighting against ISIS and protecting the holy sites against terrorists, as they call. And you also asked about Yemen and Lebanon. And in Lebanon and Yemen, it's a little bit different. It's more of a proxy support more for Hezbollah, I would say less for the Houthis, but it's also sort of a setup that Iran has had over the decades across the region to counter the U.S. or create threats for U.S. allies, Israel, which is essentially Hezbollah sitting on the border with Israel. Part of the presence in Syria also plays into that geopolitics right on the border with Israel. And then in Yemen, the Houthis are Iran's ally that essentially create a headache for Saudi Arabia and UAE, which are Iran's top rivals in the Arab world. The population, I would say, is very much divided, but a good portion is opposed to this kind of foreign policy for various different reasons, be it war crimes in Syria, be it the political, the diplomatic impact. For example, if you have a proxy set up against Israel, which is close U.S. ally, for criticism of what many see as terrorism in many of these operations. So various different reasons. I can't say all of Iran is opposed to it. There's definitely a base of support that the government and the Islamic Republic has for almost every policy, but there's also considerable criticism and resistance against it, even among political groups inside the country. So the reformists and the moderates have been critical of Iran's foreign policy over the years and have been more supportive of diplomatically modifying Iran's regional presence. As I don't know if any of you have heard of Barjam 2 or the JCPOA number 2. There was this discussion after the JCPOA was made and implemented that other issues, the missile program, Iran's regional presence, and that be negotiated and discussed in the format of JCPOA number 2 or Barjam 2. But it never got to that point. It's something I know the Biden administration is also very much interested in doing, but I don't see any of that happening in the form of an agreement without the JCPOA first being revived.
It's another issue that's been going in and out of the headlines for it seems like a couple of years now. Is this new set of internet measures, restrictions in Iran? I don't know the English name, Tarhe Sianat. This program. What's the deal there? What's the status of it? What's the impact?
And this again also goes back to the protests, because we also see a crackdown on internet, either temporary or permanent, very much in relations with protests, when protests are happening. This happened in 2009. During the 2009, the Green Movement protests, or as a result of that, we saw the Iranian government essentially filtering or banning Facebook and Twitter, which to this day is still banned. Iranians have to use circumvention, VPNs, to go around the ban. Instagram is the only social network that's not banned yet. But back then, Facebook and Twitter were seen as major mobilizing tools, and they were banned by the state or filtered. And over the years, as the protesters have gotten more savvy in their use of internet, and also there's been newer tools, messaging apps, encryptions, and all of these things. The state has both a temporary crackdown method when it comes to the actual ongoing protest, and then also more of a long-term vision on how they can limit internet for political reasons, also for social reasons. They see a lot of what they considered immoral or just not okay or unethical socially, not only politically, on the internet, from Instagram pages to chat groups on Telegram and WhatsApp. And they've been trying to crack down on a lot of social and cultural stuff as well. So the Tarhe Sianat, I'm not an expert on the actual Tarh, the plan, but it's trying to encompass a broad spectrum, all the way from political to social and cultural use of their internet, both for when instances of unrest happen, but also in longer term for access to the outside world. And there's also been this long-term plan for a national internet to essentially not completely cut off the country from the outside world, but to be able to rely on enough domestic stuff that when they need to cut off, there will be less disruptions.
So we've got another question from Brian Choquette, who asks, what does Iran's match against the U.S. in the World Cup this November mean within Iran? Is this a political opportunity? Is it just sports? I mean, and I guess we could add, you know, there was the recent friendly with Canada that got canceled. So there's definitely some politics here. What are your thoughts?
So as Iran is in the same group with the U.S. and the U.K. It was in a draw, and it's some were joking with it. It's a dark joke, but they were calling it the 1953 coup group, which is essentially Iran, the US, and the UK, but much less with the UK, because Iran does have diplomatic relations with the UK. There is travel back and forth, cultural ties, even though it's very suspicious. Iran is very suspicious of the UK still, and sees it as a close ally to the US, but it's a little different with the UK. But with the US, yes, it's a very big deal. And there's history. There was in the 1986,
I think. 86?
No, 97. There was a game I'm talking about the game between Iran and the US. It was in the 90s.
Okay.
I can check the date. Check the date, everyone. But I'm sure it has its own Wikipedia page. The US-Iran, that famous historic game where Iran qualified for the World Cup and played a game against the US, which was very political, so very nationalistic. Because at the same time, you want to see politics being separated from sports. So you also see the sense of camaraderie or sort of a diplomacy happening on the field, with the US team being very friendly to Iran by design. It was something that was previously planned. The Iranians bringing, very elaborate gifts for the US team, very expensive, I think, carpets and like Iranian handicrafts, and, the two sides publicly sort of hugging it out to counter what has been, decades of animosity. And then Iran scored a goal, which was a really big deal. I lived in Iran. I was a teenager back then. And I remember one of my friends really was saying, we literally poured to the streets and celebrated as if Iran had won the World Cup. That was how immense the feeling was with just that one goal. So yes, there's history, and it's very much, it's a reminder of how it's going to play. Even if Iran loses this time around, I think it's the game itself has so much political and historical context behind it, in a setting that also tries to be not political, but it very much is. The national team, the football team, is one of the sources of pride for many Iranians of all walks of life. It's one thing that connects from the supreme leader all the way to the crown prince, the former crown prince Reza Pahlavi. Everybody congratulates them and cheers on for them. And it's one thing that I think most Iranians hope or want to see is Team Melli, as we call it, the national team, winning. It's also the top sport. Soccer is the top sport in Iran, unlike the US, which is really not that much of a big deal. So when I talk to Americans and compare that whole national sense in Iran, it's a lot less. It happened a lot less. I don't know if you remember the date of that game, John, but I think it's less of a big deal, or it was here in the US. Do you remember following?
I don't remember it personally, no. I didn't follow that World Cup. I followed some of the later ones, though.
Yeah.
But Yeah. So just one closing question that we ask all of our guests. So what's one piece of advice that you'd give to someone who wants to follow in your footsteps professionally?
Great question. Very difficult to. I know you also have students in your network. So, it's not an easy path. It hasn't been easy for me. There's been ups and downs. I love my work. I very much enjoy what I do, but also I'm also under a lot of pressure, a lot of attacks. I live in exile. I've been forced to live in exile since 2009. After the 2009 unrest, there was a massive crackdown on the media and journalists. That's not a good feeling. I love my homeland. I mean, the US is home. I'm an Iranian American. I'm a proud immigrant and I love living here in the US, but I also loved visiting my homeland and part of my extended family that lives there. And that's been taken away from me for 13 years now and going. So that's very difficult. It was a very, very difficult decision that I made in 2009. I don't know if I would do it again if I go back, but in hindsight, it was just, I think, a very big sacrifice because I worked for Voice of America, VOA, and I was behind the scenes. But the moment I decided to go on camera and as a reporter and then later as an anchor, that really solidified my exile status because then it triggered the IRGC. I have an open case with the IRGC intelligence. So it's I can always go back, but I can't check out once I check in. I probably have to check into Evin prison. So there's that. There's also, all kinds of pressures. And also it's a global phenomenon, attacks on journalists. One side calls me an agent of the CIA, a member of the, U.S. government enemies against the U.S. because I did journalism for Voice of America. The other side, there's also certain radical political groups who consider me an agent of the Iranian regime or an apologist or a lobbyist because I do nuance. I try to be fair and objective. Like any person or any journalist, any human, I'm sure I've made mistakes and I will continue to do. But to sort of suggest or smear or accuse me of being working as an agent for a regime which also has forced me into exile, it's kind of ridiculous when I talk about it, but it's a reality. It's a daily reality I work with. So there's a lot of pressure. It's not easy. And then at the same time, as an independent or a freelance person, I'm an independent journalist and analyst, and the Iran podcast is also my own project. It wasn't easy. I didn't start out as an independent because I have a lot of young aspiring journalists or analysts coming up to me asking if they should start out or if I did start out as being independent. It's difficult. I recommend starting out with established institutions and organizations, if it's media, if it's think tanks, institutions like yours. I don't know if you take young graduates, but to try to sort of learn the work and the ways from more established settings. And then if you want, venture out on your own, build connections, build ties, build friendships, professional and personal, but mostly professional, and then sort of venture on your own or not. I mean, people might work with institutions or organizations and then move up within that. So it's difficult. US-Iran relations or tensions or the lack of relations is a very politicized field. It's very toxic also, unfortunately, especially for people of color, for women. And it's not all fun and games, but I very much like it. And I feel like I'm making a difference. I have an impact. And that's why I also get a lot of attacks, I think. I enjoy doing my work. And I'm also, let me just end by saying I'm happy to answer any more specific questions if they want to direct it to you or your colleague, Julia. You can maybe field some more questions that we didn't have time to, and send it to me later.
Yes, everybody feel free to reach out to me and we can pass those questions along. And for those of you in the audience who are interested in careers, whether in media or the other parts of foreign policy, definitely stay in touch with us, read our newsletter, get involved with our programs, because we have lots of ways of trying to help people get started in their foreign policy career. But thank you very much. We've been speaking with Negar Mortazavi about the situation in Iran. We'll be back next week with Sean Yum talking about Biden's Middle East policy. Thank you, everybody, for turning up, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.